Thank you everyone for joining. I'm going to start a little slow here because I do imagine a couple people will be trickling in. But thanks for joining us for this webinar on financed emissions. I'm Gavin McCormick. I'm Executive Director of WattTime and a co-founder of the Climate Trace Coalition of nonprofits and universities that measure emissions. And I'm really excited to be here today because financed emissions is one of the key areas where we see emissions data has a real possibility of accelerating the transition to a clean economy. And so my expertise here today is not as a finance emissions expert. I'm joined by some wonderful experts who I'll introduce in a second, but rather as a data expert. And so I wanted to kick us off here today by saying one thing I think that's really interested in the financed emissions space is how parallel the trends are to what we're seeing in other spaces. So as somebody who thinks about emissions data across different ecosystems, I'm seeing sort of two big trends this year. One big trend is towards the greater availability of open data. Didn't start this year, but we're really seeing a hockey stick. And so in a world of financed emissions, it's very parallel to what's going on in the corporate emissions community, in the national emissions community in cities, to moving from a world where you only have data on some activities and some actors, to you have at least okay data on everyone. And so I think we're going to have a very interesting conversation today about the implications of that in the financed emissions space. I'm also seeing a parallel trend that as data improve, as some actors are less interested in climate change than they have been in the past, we need to acknowledge that reality, but as many other actors are doubling down, I'm seeing a growing trend towards saying, what is the purpose of this data? What are the actions in the real world we're trying to drive here? And so I think today we're going to talk not only about increased availability of data and applications for that, but ways that new data and new uses of data and new ways of thinking about it can change sometimes what it means in practice on the ground to be pursuing financed emissions. So we'll be kind of pursuing both of those topics, and I think it'll be a really interesting conversation today. So just to give you a sense of who's in the room, I'm joined by Alex McGillivray, Executive Director of the Joint Impact Model, Arjun Ganguly, Database Team Lead of PCAF. Arjun, do you want to wave there? Let you introduce yourself in a second. And then Gerard Mulder, CEO and co-founder of Climate Risk Services. And Thomas White, manager at RMI's Center for Climate Aligned Finance. And so as a group, we have here a really interesting collection of individuals who have expertise in financed emissions, in the applications of financed emissions, and in the data. So I wanted to give you a sense that this is an unusual group because we've really managed to capture sort of the full ecosystem of applications here. And so across the world, I know very few organizations that work in financed emissions that don't interact in some way with at least one of the panelists. And so in terms of how we're going to discuss this today, we're going to start out with a little bit of introductions. We're then going to cover the topic of what are financed emissions for the few people in the room who don't have that background. How do they get used today? Who is using them today? What is the state of the art? What is the availability of data? Where are data limitations holding us back? Then we're going to move to talking a little bit to where has that changed? Where have new data from Climate Trace and many other groups started to mean that we have more transparency and visibility than we have before? Where is that getting used? Where is that not getting used? What are the places where more and better data are still needed? And then we'll transition from thinking about data per se to thinking about use cases, thinking about where different ways of thinking about financed emissions, different types of data than we're familiar with, could potentially accelerate decarbonization in ways that are related to, but a little bit different from what historical practices have always been. And so to start us off here, I thought we might start with just some introductions. So Alex, I wondered if you could share for about a minute who you are, your background, and what you do in this space.
Sure. Yeah. So Alex McGillivray. So you can probably tell that it's a Scottish surname. So originally family from Inverness, and I'm executive director of the Joint Impact Model. Previously, I worked for nearly 10 years at British International Investment, so a development finance institution with a remit to invest in Africa, South Asia, and now Southeast Asia. And a large part of the portfolio at BII was in the financial sector. So I kind of spent the last 10 years looking at both the positive contributions and the climate impact of the financial sector in emerging markets and developing economies. And the joint impact model was co-founded by a group of development finance institutions and is now a membership organization of all financial sector operating in emerging markets and developing economies, with a goal to providing sets of tools that are relevant to helping the transition towards what was your phrase, a clean economy, Gavin?
Thank you. Arjun, do you want to say a few words about your background?
Yeah, thank you, Gavin. Hi, everyone. Yeah, nice to be able to talk on this panel. My name's Arjun. I'm part of the PCAF Secretariat. Given that we're talking about finance emissions today, I'm sure many of you are familiar with PCAF. The PCAF Secretariat kind of runs PCAF, and so we support financial institutions that are part of our network. And my role at PCAF is to support financial institutions in accessing the data that they require to implement the methodologies that are part of the PCAF standards.
Thank you. Gerard, would you like to say your background?
Yes, thank you, Gavin. My name is Gerhard Mulder. I'm the CEO, co-founder of Climate Risk Services. Climate Risk Services is a small boutique advisory and data analytics firm, and our mission is to build a net zero, climate resilient, and nature positive world.
Thank you. And Tom, would you like to share a little bit what you do in the space?
Yeah, hi everybody, and thanks very much Climate Choice for the invitation to have a chat today. I'm Tom White, the manager at RMI's Centre for Climate Aligned Finance. RMI is a non-profit focused on market-driven solutions to accelerating the energy transition, and the climate finance team where I sit is focused on the financial sector's role in that transition. And we've put out a number of papers this year, which I think are relevant to this discussion, including one on actually the limitations of financed emissions. So kind of curious to see where we go with that. And also more recently, some work on the need for more granular asset level analysis and kind of some of the gaps in data and kind of turning emissions into decision-making at financial institutions. So keen to get into that today a bit too.
Thank you. And then just to say a couple words about my background. So as executive director of WattTime, one of the things I do is I help corporations increase the impact of their renewable energy purchasing. And that has led me to being a co-founder of Climate Trace. For those who are not familiar, Climate Trace is a group of about 150 universities, nonprofits, and some other researchers now who collectively measure emissions. And to Tom's point, do it at the asset level. So Climate Trace provides free open data on about 660 million different facilities and their emissions. And one of the key use cases is financed emissions. Before we kick off, I just want to say probably most people can also see Pete Bronsky there. And so Pete organized the webinar. So Pete, thanks for the support on pulling this all together. So to kick us off here, I do imagine that most people on this webinar are very familiar with what financed emissions are, but I thought it would be helpful if we could just baseline. So Arjun, PCAF is probably the leading standard in this space. I wondered if you could start by just level setting. What are financed emissions? Who uses them? What is their goal?
Right. So PCAF is about accounting for Scope 3 Category 15. So this includes finance emissions, insurance-associated emissions, and facilitated emissions. And the purpose of accounting in Scope 3 Category 15 is to attribute emissions to financial institutions. So to show that financial institutions have a real-world impact in their investment portfolios. PCAF was started around 2015, and then the first version of the standard was launched in 2019. And since then, more than 630 signatories, so financial institutions, and these include commercial banks, asset managers, owners, insurance companies, and also development banks, have signed up to PCAF, meaning that they have committed to disclose in line with the PCAF methodologies. And the numbers continuously growing. We have a number of different regional or national chapters, we call them, where we on the ground facilitates the growth in different regions. For example, right now we've just launched the India chapter. This was launched last week. We are now focusing on growth and implementation of the methodologies in this country.
Thank you. And just to stay with you for a minute, Arjun, I think it's very interesting. As I understand it, you are the data lead of an organization that, as you remember, put it, we're not trying to be the providers of the data. We're trying to help people get the data. And so I think you've thought more than almost anyone about what is the current state of, do people have the data they need for financed emissions? Where are the gaps? How would you characterize the state of the art today?
Yeah. So for any scope-free carbon accounting, but in particular for category 15, data is really the key barrier to accurate accounting. And for financial institutions, this is definitely also the case. One of the main barriers is the lack of reported data. So financial institutions, when reporting according to PCAF, rely on data that they can get from their investees. When this is unavailable, they resort to proxies, and this is also where we come in with PCAF to support financial institutions in getting reliable proxies. But the priority would be also within the PCAF methodologies is to access reported emissions data, and this is still in many sectors and also in many regions is still very much lacking, and it's slowly and steadily improving also with the increase of regulations, but it's still a key challenge in this space.
And Alex, you support some very large institutions who I think in many cases are in some particularly data scarce environments. Could you say anything about how much this is a challenge in your space and how you're addressing it?
Yeah, so we've got about 80 members, and probably investing in, I'm going to say, about 150 countries, including some of the least developed economically across the world. And so if you think of a typical multilateral development bank, they might have a portfolio of 500, 1,000 financial institutions, and then a lot more direct investments in the real economy. So kind of tracking country by country, institution by institution, sector by sector is pretty daunting. And so, as Arjun says, both PCAF and Jim have made available databases that provide sectoral proxies for banks that aren't getting data from their clients. And I'd say for our members, that's the majority of the members for the majority of their clients. And a commercial bank might have 100,000 borrowers. They're certainly not getting reliable emissions data from all of those clients, many of which are SMEs. Even the large companies will only have done a partial inventory. It won't necessarily be good quality, and it'll probably be using the same emissions factors as kind of PCAF and Jim provide in the first place. So the data hierarchy and the data availability are a real constraint. And what we hate to see is banks kind of not taking any action because they're waiting to kind of improve their quality score or fill in a few gaps in their portfolio to know the exact number. And I'd have to say that over the last 5 years, there's, one of the impediments to action has been the kind of notion that you've got to perfect your inventory first, down to the nearest gram of carbon or other gases. And to us, at least, the low-hanging fruit can be worked on much faster than that, while leaving some uncertainty in the kind of perfect emissions inventory.
Alex, I think that's really interesting in terms of this pursuit of perfect data before action can happen. In other spaces, I've certainly seen the dynamic. One that seems very memorable to me: many steel plants are 10 times more polluting than others. And many steel buyers decided that before we can switch to the ones that are 10 times cleaner, we need to figure out, are they 10.1 times cleaner or 9.9 times cleaner? And it felt very clear that we know what would be cleaner than what, and there can really be this pursuit of perfection. And so I've learned it's smart to ask, when you think about proxies, where are proxies good enough? Where are proxies not good enough? Is there anything you could say about where you think that proxies today are just fine and no more data is needed, and where we're really not ready to proceed?
So I think look, I think the big lesson from the last 5 years is that the supply chain of a client of a bank is going to have bigger emissions than its direct operations in almost all sectors. That's very clear from all of the data that we've looked at. And so if you think of a client struggling to kind of report its scope 1 and 2 emissions, let alone its scope 3. So I think proxies for scope 3, which come from input-output modeling, which is kind of at the heart of a lot of the databases that are kind of gathered today, is a really good way of figuring out where the lion's share of the emissions are going to be. And if a bank hasn't asked its clients about scope 3, then it should use a model to work out roughly what they're going to be based on sectoral averages. And if the answer is that 70% of the total emissions are in the supply chain of a client, then A, you know what to focus on, and B, you also need to start thinking about climate risk, and that's where Gerhard's team come in as well in terms of thinking about and the kind of exercise I always think of is kind of some sustainability guy in a bank saying to the chief risk officer, "Hey, I've done an inventory and I've covered, let's say 20 to 30% of our emissions. Is that good enough?" And you don't need to have worked in the financial sector for long to know that the CRO is not going to accept that. They're going to say, "No, I want to know about 100% of emissions, please." So to save time, use a model to fill in the gaps in scope 3, and then start talking to your client about getting better data on the bits of their supply chain that are going to have the biggest impact.
And Gerard, I do think that your platform is very interesting in terms of thinking about what do you do when you have data, what do you do when you don't have data, what are the different types of data. I wondered if you could say anything on this question as well. Where do you think we have enough information now? Where do you think the answer is we should keep measuring before we take action?
Great question. I think when it comes to financed emissions, Arjun was just saying something very interesting. That is, there's a lack of reported data, then people resort to proxies. But I think in between that space, I think climate trace is playing a very important role, because you're deploying new technologies to provide asset level greenhouse gas emissions data almost in real time. And that is frankly leapfrogging when it comes to the availability of data. That is like, skipping the landline and immediately, get the latest iPhone 17 Pro Max. It's really quite something else. So then the key question becomes, once you have even better data, do you then start, taking action on it? And that doesn't necessarily have to be the case. And I think what you just mentioned about the steel company and 9.9 versus 10.1, etc. I think a lot of banks, particularly in the financial sector, they're used to historical time series. They're very well, all their risk models are based on, analyzing probabilities of default, which is based on historical probabilities of default, etc. And when you have all that historical information, you can be both precise and accurate. But there's a difference between precision and accuracy. And I think when it comes to financed emissions, when it comes to, let's say, physical risk data, I think the perfect is the enemy of the good. And what we should be doing is taking that first step. So that also means that the climate trace database, fulfills a really important role here, because right now there's no excuse anymore for a bank to say, well, we don't have the data. And as they say, the future is already here. It is just unevenly distributed. So you are the future. And climate trace, it's the best database out there. It's the gold standard, the new gold standard. There's a new sheriff in town. But now it's up to us, to distribute this data. And I think that's where a role like a company like us, who engages with a lot of financial institutions in emerging markets, I should emphasize, where there's even a larger deficit of good quality data, right? And you filled the gap. And now it's up to, companies such as ours and other similar companies, but also the multilateral development banks and development finance institutions, which, we work very closely with, together with the GIM, for example, to start distributing that kind of information. And if you don't mind me, just building on that, and then I'll finish. One of the things that we recently did was writing climate-related supervisory guidelines for the Central Bank of Bangladesh. So I was in Bangladesh, Dhaka, a few weeks ago. And, I was there with, the launch, and they were presenting it to all the banks. It was fantastic. And the whole community was there. And then they said, okay, what is going to stand in the way to implementing these? And they said, data and tools. So now there's a real opportunity for the central bank, to use your data. And I said, you got to use this data. I mean, you're stupid if you don't, and build a tool around this that will then be distributed to all those 60 banks that are supervised by the central bank. So they all sing from the same song sheet, they all have the same methodology, the same data source, etc. So you can compare apples with apples, and it makes the life of a central banker much easier that way.
That's a really interesting story about the distribution. I like that about the future is already here. It's just unevenly distributed. I think we see that all the time on Climate Trace, that many areas already have excellent data, and the difference is not everywhere does. So if we were a traditional tech startup, I would say we can wrap up here. We've said that Climate Trace is excellent. The only important thing is that. But the truth is that it's a nonprofit coalition. It's all free data. The only thing that matters is, do we actually beat climate change here? And so I think in a second we should get to where is that not enough? Where is having the data and having it get used not the same as driving action? But first, I just wonder, before we move on, Alex, could you say anything more about the way that you're using Climate Trace data? I promise we'll get to all the problems in a minute. But where has it been helpful in terms of filling in gaps?
Yeah, so thanks, Gavin. Kind of, I think two areas. One that Gerhard mentioned, which is kind of filling in gaps in terms of real-time data versus time lag data. So kind of, to give an example, we're working with the bank in Vietnam, and the emissions factors that we made available to them was a static set, but they said, actually, we want emissions factors that are annually dynamic because our portfolio is changing a lot and the Vietnamese economy is changing a lot and actually decarbonizing. So using Climate Trace annual data, you can adjust static emissions factors to deflate them based on reductions by sector from Climate Trace. So that's one example. And then the second one, which I think is really exciting, is the gadget you've just recently launched, the emissions reduction pathways. And so going to the Bangladesh example that Gerhard mentioned, so the banks kind of, they can know their number, and, there's a typical bank in Bangladesh, oh, wow, here's our scope 3 category 15 emissions, 4 million tons. Let's send the number to the central bank. Central bank's happy, they've done their supervision. It kind of ends there. And even some of these banks don't realize that they should be doing this again next year as well. So the sort of disclosure regime that kind of may well work in markets where there's a lot more scrutiny and a lot more NGO capacity to look at data that's being disclosed. That, I don't think that's the main engine in countries like Bangladesh. The main engine in countries like Bangladesh is how can the banks lend more money to clients that is green lending or clean finance, which will reduce emissions. So in Bangladesh, your emission reduction pathways show that the vast majority of emissions reductions that are available right now are in the agri sector. And yet, development finance institutions are mainly financing emissions reductions in the ready-made garment sector. And the emissions reduction potential there, according to your data, is pretty small. So that suggests a misallocation of climate finance that should be going into agri, and particularly rice, where you'd make meaningful reductions to the emissions in Bangladesh. But I'd go one step further, which is Bangladesh has pretty low emissions anyway. So emissions accounting is really a way for the banks to get to know their clients. The Bangladesh its principal job isn't to reduce its emissions even further. 340 million tons for a population of nearly 200 million people. I mean, it's kind of, it's already a low emitting country with very high risks. So the real problem in Bangladesh is a misallocation of climate finance. There's not enough of it, and too much is going into mitigation and not nearly enough into adaptation and resilience. So again, using Climate Trace data to get meaningful discussions with clients about how to make themselves more resilient and access more international climate finance. I think that's the game changer for a country like Bangladesh.
Thanks. I think we see that in every sector when we're talking to nation states, cities, companies, investors. We always see that measurement is the first step. And if you don't also then take it to the second step of what is your action going to be, what are we doing here? And so wanted to make sure everyone sort of sees that point that free data from Climate Trace and many other institutions are now available. These are all great places to get it. But I want to turn now to this point about misallocation of resources, or I think a better way to say it is cases where there could be even more optimal allocation of resources, because it's all helpful. So I keep coming back to this point that it is possible to divest from a coal plant and the coal plant doesn't shut down. And it is possible to divest from a coal plant and really close it down. It is possible to build renewable energy and really reduce emissions. It is possible to buy a renewable energy certificate and you actually didn't cause a power plant to get built. So as we turn the conversation from having data to what are the results of these actions, Tom, I think you've thought particularly carefully about this. In terms of what needs to happen, even just the name climate aligned finance as opposed to the Center for Financed Emissions, I think is an interesting opener. Where do you think the momentum needs to be in the actions that will really reduce emissions in this space?
Yeah, I mean, our focus for the last couple of years had very much been on financed emissions and on transparency and disclosure. And I think the original theory of change was that disclosure would lead to changes in decision-making kind of just inherently, naturally. But I think that financed emissions is just not the language of financial decision-making. And I think there's the kind of a gap between you get this financed emissions number, how do you operationalize that? How do you turn that into a decision at a transaction, right? And so I think that those two parts of a financial institution just don't really have a way of talking to each other right now. And I think we really need to close that gap. I think financed emissions is like the step zero, but exactly to the point you just made around you need the action that follows it up. I think that now we need to then use financed emissions, like where are our hotspots, where are the emissions coming from? And then we need to get into like really granular asset level analysis of those hotspots. That's hard to do. So I think there's like a lot of new tools that need to be built to do that. But I think once you have those hotspots, you can look at your clients and say, not just what are your scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions, cool, but what does your CapEx plan look like? Are you investing in like the technologies to transition? Are you doubling down on high carbon assets? If you are, how does that reconcile with the policy environment in the jurisdictions where you operate? How does that reconcile with how we expect low carbon technologies to evolve and cost? And then that now is the language of financial institutions that impacts their risk profile, that presents great opportunities for business development, and it turns the kind of sustainability arm of the bank into a real value add of like contributing to these other parts of the organization and not just disclosure focused with kind of the hope that will bleed into everything else.
And Tom, if I can stay with you for a minute, I hear often that this change to asset level is important. So for example, I've heard that on nationally determined contributions from countries, often they are so vague and high level, it's actually a bit unclear what that implies for investment opportunities. But I've also heard that sometimes that asset level is the wrong aggregation because often investors are thinking which company they choose. So how much would you say that asset level data is the key? Is it one among a couple types of data? How should we be thinking when we're thinking about hotspot data?
I think, to identify your hotspots, you're probably going to look at the company level, but I think you really have to go to the asset level to have an informed engagement with your client, to understand like what are their high intensity assets that are really high risk, which ones maybe aren't so high risk, what does their investment pipeline look like, what technologies are they getting into. If you're just at the company level, I think it's much harder to have those conversations. It's much harder to actually kind of arrive at an engagement with a client with informed questions. It's just going to stay at the like, what are your emissions? What does that mean for like your risk profile? Kind of just at that level, not getting down to the technology, the kind of the language of the financial institution. It's remaining in this just like, what do your emissions look like? It's a little bit fluffier, and it's not what financial institutions, like how financial institutions are used to operating.
Alex, what are you thinking?
So I think it's obviously going to be a combination because Tom's completely right. But to go back to that Bangladesh agri example, a company and an asset. These are kind of rice farmers, right? And they're often small holdings, but with very high aggregate emissions. So I don't think there's any point of banks sort of going kind of farmer by farmer through to kind of work out. But the big opportunity there is in new varieties of rice and new technologies that can reduce the reliance on paddy rice and go to dry rice farming. So that on the one hand, they're looking at the kind of assets and clients and thinking, wow, there's a big chunk of emissions here. But on the other hand, they're thinking, how can we invest in companies that provide solutions to this diverse group of clients? So I think that's different from a kind of Brazilian steel company with 10 assets across the country and maybe a few in other countries as well, where you do want to go asset by asset as well as company level. So it depends on the sector, I'd say.
Yeah, that's a useful flag. I think my bias is very much in industrial decarbonization, where it is a more countable number of assets and you really have to, like, an asset is a big deal. But there's, I think, yeah, peeling back maybe a strategic point around which sectors are you actually focusing on and then tailoring your strategy accordingly.
Arjun, we've certainly had conversations about the difference between having asset level and company level information. As you're well aware, one of the big weaknesses of Climate Trace is we can often see what are the emissions of an asset, but we don't always know who owns it. I wonder if you could talk through why sometimes that's a challenge and why sometimes you do need company level information.
Yes. So the way the PCAF methodology works is that when you have an outstanding amount with a business, you need to be able to attribute the emissions of that business to you as a financial institution. In order to do that, you need to know the exposure, so the outstanding amount, and you need to know the total EBIC, so the total assets of this company. You also need to know the emissions of the company. Now, that ratio of emissions and EBIC of total assets, that is quite important to be able to attribute the emissions. If you were to only do that on an asset level, you wouldn't have a representative picture of the emissions of that company where your loan is. So essentially you would be misattributing the emissions. So for the PCAF methodology, it is important that you would have the emissions of the company and also the financial data of the company rather than at an asset level.
Thank you. And I think that to me,
Of course,
sorry.
Of course, if a loan would be specific to an asset, so it wouldn't just be a general business loan, but it would be for an asset, then it changes. Then the asset level data is very useful. And actually, for the asset class in the PCAF methodology, project finance, there we would often find that you would want to use asset level data over company level data.
The way I think about that is when you're making different choices, you need different types of data. And so what are the actions that are going to result from this data? If you are going to choose between one company or another to invest in, and it won't be tied to a specific project, maybe you need company level. If you're going to be choosing between projects, maybe you need the project level emissions. And I thought you made an interesting point, Alex. Sometimes what you're really doing is you're investing in technologies that could reduce emissions. That's a whole category separately entirely. And so I think of these all in terms of the choice you are making, what would be the difference in the world's emissions if you choose this or that, sometimes called consequential emissions factors. And I know that this is a growing area as well. More companies are starting to measure the consequential, or they sometimes call it avoided emissions, impact of different investments. Again, the difference between exiting a company or that company actually moving away from emissions, the difference between investing in a technology that could reduce more emissions or investing in a technology that won't really change anything. And so I wondered, Alex, if you could talk anything more about real choices you see investors, institutions actually making with data, and what are the types of things they really need more information about?
Yeah, so I think I keep mentioning Bangladesh, but I think it's kind of, like really on the as a sort of one of the most climate vulnerable countries with a kind of big, slightly sprawling financial sector, an activist central bank, as Gerhard mentioned, a big population, kind of very smart, very good reasons to take climate action, but where there's kind of clearly blockages in the system, including kind of access to international finance. So I mean, I think the kind of, if you go around Dhaka, you could see a kind of garment factory that has international household name buyers, clothing brands in it with kind of a green roof, and it would look like something you wouldn't be surprised to see in Switzerland. And right next door, you'll see a brick field. And the brick fields, the emissions are 100 times higher per unit of GDP, probably more, in fact. And you've also got significant air pollution. Now, I'm not denying that there are social and environmental challenges still remaining in RMG, but the disproportionality of the effort in decarbonising a low carbon sector or relatively low carbon sector compared to total absence of activity from international finance on a super high emissions sector that also kills countless people through air quality problems. Then you kind of go on and you'll see a kind of informal settlement where people are living under tin roofs, suffering extreme heat, and where there's then zero climate finance going into making those informal settlements habitable. That's really striking, and the kind of local banks are well aware of it, but what they tell us is that currently adaptation and resilience is funded through their CSR budgets, which many of you will know would be kind of 1% of operating profits, if it happens at all. So the kind of imbalance here is quite striking, and kind of I understand why people feel they need to act on RMG because it's a highly scrutinized sector through years and decades of NGO campaigning, and I've played my part in that as well. But I feel that now kind of proportionality is very necessary. So this kind of idea of hotspotting that we've all talked about, I think really helps to kind of figure out not just where the emissions are, where the risks are, but then it should be where the opportunities are. And what would be great would be to see the kind of probably a severe misallocation of finance. And I'm confident this applies in Africa and Latin America as well as in South Asia and Southeast Asia. But to kind of reallocate some finance to adaptation and resilience and to kind of just increase the kind of flow of money into the countries that are most vulnerable and where there are also emissions that are worth reducing, but they won't be in the sectors that people are most familiar with and where you can sell some German electrical equipment that will give you a kind of incremental improvement in efficiency. It will require people kind of getting familiar with some technologies that weren't used in Europe and the US for 50 or 100 years, like brick kilns.
It's interesting. You've mentioned a couple of times this notion of, I think of it as sort of low-hanging fruit. And so with global data at Climate Trace, something we see all the time is massive differences and spreads in what looks like it would be the emissions impact and rate of return of projects that are getting invested in versus those that are not. And so something we often see on the corporate side, even the largest companies in the world are often unaware of investment opportunities halfway around the world, or sometimes even in their own area, but a sector they're less familiar with. And so we see a huge discrepancy in the data that capital is very unevenly allocated, and it doesn't always appear to be going to the highest return areas. It does look like there's a lot of overlooked opportunities because of the data. And so at Climate Trace, the best thing we're thinking of doing is in November, we're going to roll out a tool that is our best estimate of emissions impact per dollar of different opportunities around the world. And we see huge spreads there. It won't be perfect. It needs to be looked at by experts like yourselves. But we do see some really striking spreads. Yeah.
And one thing our members are really expert is kind of knowing what the kind of risk kind of adjusted return needs to be in all different countries, but most of them are now also prepared to admit that in most cases the kind of international community seems to have hiked the risk premium beyond what's justified by the real level of risk, and are too risk averse for these opportunities. So if you could imagine that more transparency on that will also help burst a few bubbles and kind of show that the risk isn't nearly as great in some countries and some sectors as people have got used to thinking it is.
Garrett, I see that you have a thought, and then I'm going to ask you a second question.
No, I think you just raised an interesting point, and that is that the investments and the lending should go to those areas where there's the highest return. But that is also, there's some micro level dynamics inside a bank that may actually prevent from capital being deployed to where it is needed the most. Having worked for a bank for about 10 years, banks don't finance sectors and topics that they don't fully understand. It's really that simple. So you can, have this fantastic theoretical, return on investment, but they just won't do it because they don't understand where they put their money in. Right. So they need to build that capacity, and that micro level analysis, like how banks make decisions, I think is really key to understand whether they're going to be deploying capital into decarbonization and transition planning. And I think, therefore, a key stakeholder inside a bank is the relationship manager. Right? Everything that you do goes through the relationship manager. When I was the climate change expert at ABN AMRO Bank about 20 years ago, I was visiting clients together with the relationship manager. I did not dare to even reach out to any of his clients or her clients because that relationship was owned by the relationship manager. So that is a key stakeholder that we need to target. And that person manages a whole portfolio of companies. They have about 10 to 20 different product lines, for example. Right. So I think what we need to think about is how can we make sure that that relationship manager gets the right tools and is empowered to start that conversation, because it all stops and starts with this person. And that is, yeah, go ahead.
It's interesting. That's just very parallel to what we see in other fields as well. It's amazing how much decarbonization, even at the national level, if you don't have that relationship manager with awareness on the ground of this exact relationship, you can make all the wrong decisions.
Because it also touches on, what do we use all this data for? Is it just for disclosure? At which point it's usually the people, the very nice people in the sustainability department inside a bank, but that's usually also, with all respect, and I used to belong to one of them, is, it's the NGO within the bank. They have very low standing within the bank. The kings in the bank, the kings and queens in the banks, the ones that make the money are the relationship managers, right? So, and therefore we need to turn this carbon accounting and financed emissions and all the tools and all the concept and the methods, etc., from much more of a disclosure focus to a strategic engagement focus. And I think when I look at financed emissions now, it's like looking in the mirror. It allows you to look backward. And I think one of the coolest things, also building on what Alex was saying, is to have that forward-looking metric within your database, I think is going to make a really big difference. So what are the decarbonization opportunities, for example? Right, if you include that in the climate trace database, which you're doing or planning on doing, then that's a big step forward, because then we can combine the past with the future, and I think that's where probably one of the biggest levers of systemic change is at.
Totally agree. Yeah, it's exciting times.
Maybe I'll circle back to you in a second, because that's such a good segue. So Tom, RMI has thought more carefully than almost anyone I know about where could we go next. Some of the RMI tools that are part of Climate Trace are thinking about how could you decarbonize on certain landfills more effectively? What are the best investment opportunities in steel and so on? I wondered if you could say anything about, at a real nuts and bolts operational level, what tools does RMI provide and what would you recommend in terms of how we can move faster?
Yeah, I mean, I know our industries team and like climate intelligence teams that sit parallel with the climate finance team, doing a lot of work on kind of what is the best like return on investment. I think to the tool you're talking about for different in different sectors, trying to kind of lower the barriers to on a risk basis for investing in these sectors. In my team, a lot of the work we're doing right now is on, to the point I was making before about closing the gap between kind of financed emissions and like decision making. We're doing a lot of work on like how should financial institutions assess their clients, like what kind of questions should they actually ask? And I think to Gerhard's point, the exact thing is like, what does your forward-looking investment pipeline look like? Are you investing in the things that we, the technologies that we care about, or at least, have you thought about it enough so that to hedge your bets if the transition proceeds at different paces? one, I think, important aspect of that is benchmarking that against different pathways. So, you know, what's the world going to look like? Not just kind of looking at business as usual projections, which I think kind of financial institutions are very used to looking at, but expanding that into, you know, what the NDCs say their expectations are, particularly when they are granular and they have very specific technology targets to hit. You know, is the company keeping pace with that if the policy environment like steers in that direction? And so we're putting together a repository of pathways so that banks can essentially go and look up in this sector, you know, what's the scope of everyone who's thought about what the future might look like in this space for different temperature goals, for different like policy goals. There's a lot more, I think, scenarios available than people realize if you kind of go and look, but banks typically and financial institutions broadly don't have the resources to go and do that in every sector, in every region. So we're trying to centralize that work. And I think that will be a really powerful tool to like enable the sustainability teams to quickly like look up, you know, what does the future look like, or what's the kind of array of futures look like in this space, and then like how can we think about the client's role in that, like kind of what pathways are they aligned to. So not just have they set a 1.5 target, which is great, but you know, and we're particularly focused on the power sector in Southeast Asia, and benchmarking against the 1.5 doesn't tell you a lot about the risk profile of your clients operating in that space. So rather it's, how does their alignment look to NDCs? How does it look compared to technology pathways? You know, like what's their adoption of renewable energy look like? And then getting into, okay, given that basis, are they also investing in the infrastructure needed to put that into place? So yeah, I think that guidance combined with this kind of repository of pathways could be a really powerful tool.
Yeah, thank you.
Can't wait. Can't wait
Yeah.
to see that. Tom, looks really great. Gavin, I'm conscious we've got a few questions in the Q&A thing. I tried to answer a couple, but some were kind of outside my kind of knowledge base. But I guess at the very least we should undertake to answer them.
I think that's right.
After, if we can't do it during the next 15 minutes or so. But I think, Leila, your question about kind of disclosure regimes was partly answered by Gerhard, and kind of our comments about kind of moving beyond disclosure into a central entity towards kind of moving towards dialogue with your clients as being a kind of likelier form of action in some ways. But I think in Europe and California, you can imagine the regulators exercising some real leverage when they get the data coming in through a disclosure regime. But elsewhere, I think that there's lower hanging fruit that can be grasped by kind of working directly with clients and international investors. So I hope that partly answers your question.
Thanks for that. Yeah, I think we have a few other questions it'd be good to get to. Maybe just one step before we do that, I just thought it would be helpful to sort of summarize what we are seeing. So, Tom, I really liked how you sort of brought it around to what are some of the key takeaways that folks should be walking away with. I wondered if we could also ask the others to do that. So I wonder if Gerhard, you would say anything about if there's kind of one message people walk away with today, or one resource or next step, what would you recommend?
One resource to walk away with. Well, you need to take that first step, and the perfect is the enemy of the good. And I think that's what Alex was saying, and everybody probably agrees on, is that you cannot wait for perfect data. Perfect data doesn't exist, because there's always next level. There's always more accurate. There's always more a higher level of confidence. But data is not a obstacle for taking action. And I think what we need, frankly, what we really need is within banks, people that are less focused on trying to achieve high level of precision and accuracy, but have a notion that we do not always talk about risk, but we also talk about uncertainty, that we need to replace risk with uncertainty sometimes. So we need to redesign some of the tools that banks have in order to inform their risk management, and have less of a focus on these historical time series, but have more of a focus on, what plausible future states of the world are we looking at? Is this a high emissions world? Is this a low emissions world? And how can we generate strategic options that make us relevant for as many plausible future states of the world. So I think, you know, that's not an exact answer to your question, but maybe a bit of a broader reflection, if you don't mind.
I think it's a great answer in terms of moving to operational decision making is a big part of what I'm hearing there. Arjun, would you like to say any closing thoughts about what you would recommend?
Yeah, sure. First of all, I totally agree with what Gerhard just said. I think it was very well put. A first step is required. This is in terms of data, but also in terms of, and this is also what PCAF is about. So it's taking a first step on the decarbonization journey. First step is to acknowledge that you as a financial institution have an impact with your investments, and that you disclose this in real terms, so in absolute finance emissions. Absolute finance emissions, even though it does have drawbacks, is still a very important metric to define this. And then I think Gavin, earlier when we were talking about the selecting the right data for your needs, I think this is also a very important point that I hope everyone takes away, that it's not necessarily about getting the best data, it's about getting the right data for your purposes. If it's about estimating your total portfolio emissions, then maybe proxies are sufficient. If it's about trying to find the emissions for a business loan, a general business loan, then yes, you need company emissions. And then if it's more specifically tied to an asset, then asset-based emissions, such as provided by Climate Trace, are the right data point to collect.
Thanks. I think that captures it so succinctly. Alex, any final thoughts before we move to a few minutes of questions?
Well, I think I've kind of said it, but I think financial institutions, they do and they should love their clients' supply chains, rather than thinking that kind of scope 3 of clients is some kind of painful bit of kind of homework. That's where relationship managers should come alive, because that's where new business opportunities sit. So kind of that kind of flip, everything that we do should be helping banks engage with their clients about supply chain emissions as well as direct emissions. I think the other thing that I think would be really helpful is to help banks figure out their positive impacts. Most banks in most countries kind of are expected to do nation building rather than to kind of admit their terrible kind of climate sins. And so kind of whether it's kind of contributions to GDP or the contributions to supporting jobs in the economy, if banks can figure that out, then they can genuinely start to think about a just transition where they don't destroy jobs through their climate strategies, but where they do start creating green jobs or clean jobs. And I think kind of, switching the narrative to loving the supply chain and thinking about positive as well as negative impacts would really help banks kind of become more action oriented, and that money will flow to banks that have a big idea.
And to that point, you can increasingly get this from Climate Trace, but other groups like Project Frame are increasingly providing data on what would be the emissions impact of different investment decisions, not just the reduction. Switching quickly to a few questions, and we can follow up by email on a few others if helpful. Kodamarthi asks, the scope 3 for banks boils down to the intensity of the industry they finance. They don't reduce emissions directly. And so one of the key questions is, should environment ministries and finance ministries be really measuring the emissions? Do we think that it is necessary for banks to measure emissions in the first place? Seems to me that we've been aligning towards it is good to measure emissions, but you can't stop there. But would anyone go further? Does anyone think we shouldn't have banks measuring emissions?
I'll take a stab at that, if you don't mind. I mean, what do banks do? What's the role of banks, right? Banks actively seek risk. That is what they do. Because they manage risk better than anyone else. And that's why we trust them with our money. But right now, many banks are sitting on risks that they don't monitor, that they're not managing and not reducing. And worst of all, they're not being compensated for. Right? That's exactly what happened with the housing bubble. They were sitting on risks. They thought they were AAA, and it turned out it was like triple nothing. So that is the key. So banks most certainly then have a role to play in measuring their emissions, because it's a source of risk. But right now, if you don't measure those risks, you're not monitoring it, you're not being compensated for it. The thing with risk is that it usually ends up with the banks that understand it the least. It doesn't end up with the banks that manage it. It's the best. And therefore, we need resources such as Climate Trace, so we can bring some transparency around this. I hope that answers your question.
Any thoughts? Does anyone think we should not be measuring emissions at banks? Great, then I hope that answered that. And then just thinking about time, so Richard Dunn, I see your question on what are the main challenges faced by companies trying to prepare and execute an effective plan to reduce emissions. I think we've spoken to that a little bit, so happy to talk more offline, but I think some of this talk about hotspotting and risk kind of addresses that. So I thought, Alex, maybe we could move to you. There was this question from an anonymous attendee that you had mentioned you might answer about, I've heard the NBFC or commercial banks prefer a project mode climate financing rather than product mode financing. Isn't this a setback for innovative climate technologies accessing timely finance for growth? What would you say?
So I mean, I think I don't think either one is the wrong approach. I think it partly depends on the kind of size of the problem in the sector and the country and what the opportunities are. So I think kind of like a lot of international finance is project based, and so I think it's natural that's going to be the focus. I think a lot of solutions in the agri space aren't even products but services, and so I love to see banks that are kind of looking to kind of build client relationships with agri tech providers, and you certainly see in India where kind of PCAF has set up their new chapter. You see it in Bangladesh, you see it across Latin America of kind of banks forming partnerships with agri-tech companies to provide a solution to their clients that are kind of too numerous to work with one-on-one, whether it's in kind of high emitting sectors like rice paddy or cattle in Latin America. The solutions there are going to be services, not neither products nor projects. So I think kind of, to make your question even more complex, I think it's kind of product, service or project. You need all three in your toolkit.
All right, I'm ambitiously going to try to cram in 2 questions in 2 minutes. So Mariana asks, would it be possible at any time to get an aggregated company emissions from Climate Trace at the LEA or ISN level? Otherwise, banks will have to do this themselves. It's probably not going to happen. The short version is you can already do that. So you can already go to Climate Trace and you can get estimates at the LEI level. The problem is that there are some facilities we don't know the owner of. So you should think of that as a lower bound on the emissions at the LEI level. And we are working with many groups, some on this call, others also like MSCI, to try to improve that ownership data. I suspect the long run answer is that there will be intermediaries that will provide that data from Climate Trace and a mix of other sources. But it is absolutely where this ecosystem, I think, is going for kind of open data available from a number of different distributors at the LEI level. And so,
it's amazing what you can. It's amazing what you can scrape from the internet on ownership as well. So there's only 3 AI note takers on this call, but like AI is going to play a huge role in kind of forcing more transparency into this kind of asset to owner black hole that kind of currently exists in a lot of places.
Totally, and so it's not completely comprehensive, but it's amazing.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to try to cram in one last question. So Giando asked, how are the different languages of finance's quarterly earning calls aligned to law's disclosure obligations? What are the best use cases in government's direct subsidies in green finance by banks? And I wondered, Alex, if you could sort of conclude by reminding this point about how its capital is unevenly distributed and some of the areas where banks could be doing more.
Yeah, so in fact, I think, Janda, we were just talking about this earlier today in the context of Vietnam, and it's a great example of a country that kind of probably is the banks are kind of under a lot of pressure quarterly, and where they're probably underinvested, I would say, from development finance for kind of various reasons, but where you could certainly imagine concerted action in the financial sector, beginning with good housekeeping and kind of clean emissions inventories, good risk assessments, transition risk analysis, showing that they have good visibility and control over their clients, that unlocking more finance from the development finance and MDBs. So I think that would be a great laboratory, and something that it'd be really good to see action there.
Perfect. Well, sorry to go about 30 seconds over there, but thanks everyone for joining us today. I thought this was a really interesting conversation. We'll try to follow up with a few more answers online if that's helpful to anyone by email. Don't hesitate to reach out.